action.
Okay, so welcome. I'm Dr. Delaney. Some of you may have seen me speak before, some of you may not have. Just a little bit of my background. I actually spent about 6 years teaching your favorite subject, anatomy and physiology. I do not have an anatomy and physiology background. I'm going to tell you a little secret. I got a C in anatomy and physiology. It was not my biggest strength, but I had to learn it to be able to get through nursing school. So what I did learn was how to learn anatomy and physiology. So my first semester I got a C, my second semester I got an A. I figured it out, okay? And so what I was really interested in and how I ended up teaching anatomy and physiology was the fact that nursing students really have a certain way of looking at things. And that's kind of how I ended up teaching anatomy and physiology, was to kind of teach in a program that was directly directly feeding into nursing programs. So I was looking specifically at the nursing angle. So I do have a lot of experience. So just as an aside from this, if you're ever on the 3rd floor and you're like, I just don't understand what that calcium does in muscle contraction and my door is there, stop by any time and I'll give you a quick lesson on how muscles contract or whatever it is, because I can do that kind of pretty simple explanation for you that sometimes it's a little bit harder for people who are super expertise to kind of break it down a little bit. But what I really want to talk to you about today is what we call active learning strategies. And basically what I've talked about in the past was how to go through and take really good notes and to make sure that you're understanding processes before you actually go through and put in the technical names. Now I want to get your head out of the book. So I want to talk a little bit more about how do we get our head out of the book and focus more on how do we actually apply things, which is what we're really looking at with anatomy and physiology. So this is something that you will become very familiar with in nursing school. This is a theory called Bloom's taxonomy, and I'm not asking you to know the theory, but what I'm asking you is to understand there's different levels of understanding information. Now, for people who struggle with anatomy and physiology, it's because usually they only study at the recall level. They get really good, and I see people in my office all of the time who can walk in and literally recite the entire chapter to me. They have memorized every word. And then I say, okay, what does that mean? And they have no idea. Well, if you can't tell me what you just recited to me means, how are you going to answer a test question on it? So what we need to do is, yes, you have to be able to recall what's in the book or recall what's in the lecture, but more importantly, you have to translate it into your own words. So when you're starting off, and I know you guys are doing muscle contraction right now, if you can't remember myosin, call it a golf club. Call it the golf club that hooks into the other thing, and then they come together and they pull, and we know that it goes like this. Describe it in your own terms, okay? And then, as you get more comfortable describing it in your own terms, you can stop calling it a golf club and start calling it myosin. Now you're going to start making sense of it because it makes sense to you and you haven't just memorized a sentence that says myosin in it, but you have no idea what myosin is or what it looks like or what it hooks into. So you've got to make sure that you're moving yourself beyond recall, just memorizing what's in the textbook or what's in the lecture or your lecture notes, into translation. But that's not enough. You also have to be able to interpret it. You have to be able to understand the information in relationship to other ideas. So for instance, again, we're going to stick with muscles because I know that's where you guys are at, most of you. If I say to you there's not enough calcium in the body, what does that mean in terms of muscle contraction? So you have to be able to say, okay, what's happening? Not only can I have to be able to describe how calcium plays a role with attaching to the active site and then pulling the tropomyosin away from the troponin, everything along that so the myosin head can get in. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we need to spend some time in the textbook, right? So that if we don't know what's going on there, or if you're able to describe that, but if you don't understand what happens if calcium's missing, the fact that the whole process will never start, then you're not able to interpret that information. So you have to be able to also interpret information, take pieces out and say, okay, what happens if this is not there? What happens if this is not there? What happens if I have tons of calcium? Does that mean that my muscles are going to continuously contract? No, because I only have so many receptors for calcium. So if I have tons of calcium, it doesn't mean I'm going to have a continuous contraction of my muscles, but if I don't have enough calcium, then my muscles aren't going to contract. So I have to be able to interpret information. I have to be able to understand what's going on with the information that I have. And then I have to be able to apply it. And this is where you're getting to your test questions. So for those of you who are going through and you're reading your textbook or reading your class notes, maybe rewriting your class notes, maybe typing your class notes, and then going straight to questions, you're skipping 2 key steps. And that's probably why you're not getting the grades that you want to get in class. Because you're not going through and putting it in your own words and you're not figuring out how to interpret it. You're going straight from recall to application. How do I apply it in a test question setting? And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges that you're facing because you're not going to be able to understand why you're getting questions right and wrong. You're not going to understand the explanations of those questions because you don't know how to interpret the explanations because you can't put it in your own words. You can only go back and look at the class notes and say, this is what it says about that, let me memorize that again. But again, then you jump straight back to another test question and you're going straight back to applying. So you have to make sure that you're learning information in these steps, that you're going through, you're able to recall what's there, you're putting it in your own words, then you're going through and you're being able to interpret what happens in different scenarios, and lastly, you're doing those practice questions that you're finding either associated with your textbook or online. Analysis questions, you'll see those when you get into your junior year, so I'm not so worried about those right now. And then synthesis and evaluation, that's even further levels of critical thinking that we're not so much going to get into at this point, but just know it does go on from there. So why is this important? Well, this is the general cycle of learning. To be able to understand a concept, you have to remember it. To be able to apply a concept, you have to be able to understand it. To be able to evaluate a process, you have to be able to analyze it. And to be able to create an accurate conclusion, you have to have completed an evaluation. So again, in anatomy and physiology, we're really concerned about these first 2 boxes here. Remembering what concepts we're talking about so that we can understand what those concepts are, and then being able to apply those concepts once we understand what those concepts are. And I'm going to emphasize this again, in our own words. How many people in here do I have that take their class notes and rewrite or retype them? Do I have a good number there? That's something I see all the time in my office. When you rewrite them or retype them, and I don't need to see a show of hands, how many people write word for word what the professor said or what was in the book instead of putting it in your own words? If you're writing it word for word what the professor said or what came from the book, then you're not making sure you understand what's coming up, what's going down. So really what you're doing is you're becoming a really good transcriptionist. You're doing a really good job at transcribing things, but you're not doing a good job at learning things. So you need to make sure that you're taking that extra step and not just copying your class notes or copying the textbook, but you're putting it in your own words, because this is not transcriptionist school. This is not a school where we're teaching you how to be better typists. This is a school where we're teaching you how to be able to critically apply anatomy and physiology to our patients in the future. So when we look at these, I want to break it down for you a little bit. So if we look at tasks, recall, that's going to be our anatomy. Okay, so recall, vocabulary. Those are going to be the key parts here. And when you are looking at your different anatomy parts, I want you to look at prefixes and suffixes. So when I look at things and try to think about what makes sense to you. So I always say, if I look at something that says endo, and I'm looking at the histology layers, I always think endo inside. Okay, so endo inside. That lets me usually know that that's around the lumen of something. If I see myo in front of something, myo means muscle. So that's usually some sort of muscular layer that I'm going to have there. Paramecium, okay, usually is between endo and exo. And exo is almost always the most outside layer. That's going to be true for any organ system. So instead of learning the same things over and over and over again as you go through different organ systems, look for what you've already learned. If you've already learned that endo means inside, peri means middle, and exo means outside, and you just have a different suffix after it to mean a different organ system, then that's one last thing that you have to memorize for that test. So you want to make sure that as you're paying attention to recall, you're paying attention to what vocabulary you've already focused on and what can you carry forward from that. So there's going to be some things that, like the endo, the peri, the exo, that you always want to pay attention to. Memorizing your anatomical landmarks. So muscles, right? That's what we're talking about right now. I don't want you just studying muscles by looking in the book. That is not going to be a good way to study muscles. Anyone know the best way to study muscles? Use them. I don't care if you never go to the gym. Go to the gym. Go and use the weight machines. Put it on 0 pounds. I don't care. But what's really nice at the gym is they have a lovely picture on those weight machines of what muscles you're using. And you will be able to feel the muscle you're using and see a picture of it at the same time as you're trying to memorize where it's located. That's going to be active learning. So if you don't feel comfortable going to the gym, then look up muscles and think about how to stretch them on YouTube. But the best way to use muscles, and muscles is a lot easier than the skeletal system, because the skeletal system, it's kind of hard to think about, you know, I'm using this bone right now. The muscles, it's a lot easier to think about, okay, right now I'm using my biceps. I'm using my triceps. I'm using whatever muscle I'm using. Think about how you're using it. Get out of that textbook. Memorize the anatomical landmarks by moving. Same with joints. Don't memorize joints by studying them in the book. Get up and move. Movement is good for studying anyway. Did you know there's tons of research that actually shows you will remember more if you study while walking on a treadmill or riding a bike than you do if you sit in a chair? There's something about the endorphins that are released about exercising while studying that you remember more. So you are not only going to be able to have a different way of learning, but you will remember more about those anatomical landmarks by using them than you will by sitting in a desk sitting at pictures. Recall the name of enzymes or chemicals used in the physiological process. This is now getting into the physiological aspect of things. So you want to think about, again, what do you know? You should be able to recognize right away anything that ends in ASE is an enzyme. Anything that ends in ASE, you know right away it has to do with a chemical reaction. And usually the nice thing about enzymes is the first part of the word tells you what chemical they're reacting with. So if you see something and ASE after it, you are knowing it's a chemical reaction for whatever the prefix is. Again, that takes a lot of study time away. That's one less vocabulary word you have to use because you're just saying ASE and whatever's at the beginning of it, chemical reaction for the beginning of that. So these are going to be your recall tests, and these are things that you have to go through. But think about creative ways of going through them instead of just ways of putting your head in the book, rewriting notes, instead of just looking at pictures. These are better ways to do it. So questions that you could ask yourself that you might have for recall: what is the enteric nervous system? So that would be for something related to GI. That would be a direct recall question. And you want there to be able to say what the enteric nervous system is in your own words. Not a specific definition, but basically what that would be in your own words is, it's the nervous system of the GI system. So the enteric nervous system is the nerves that lead to the GI system. That would be a really good way to put it in your own words. How many lobes are there of the liver? What are they called? So again, another example of a recall question. Or what enzymes are there in gastric juices would be another recall question. Now, tasks related with translation are all about paraphrasing information. So what I always try to have people do is, before they sit down to study a chapter, is to come up with 5 goals for learning. Flip through your book, your textbook, flip through your class notes, flip through your notes from, or your PowerPoints, and say, what are the 5 most important things that I need to learn from this chapter? And when you have those 5 important things, now you have 5 goals. So instead of feeling totally overwhelmed by the entire chapter, you have 5 goals that you're going to focus on for that chapter. Now when you have those 5 goals, you're going to go through, and they should be pretty, broad goals, not like name this one enzyme. That's not what you're looking for. You're looking for 5 goals that kind of cover the whole chapter. But what you're trying to do there is when you go through your notes, you want to be able to read through the notes, read through the book, and then at the end of those sections say, okay, my question was, one of my tasks is to be able to understand how a muscle contraction works. So then you paraphrase how muscle contractions work in your own words. But it doesn't have to be your own words. It could be your own words, your own picture, your own diagram, whatever works for you depending on how you learn. Now the other thing that I like about the 5 goal piece is that if you say my first goal is to understand how muscle contraction works, and you read the book and you're like, I still have no clue how muscle contraction works, and you look through your class notes and you're like, I still have no clue how muscle contraction works, now you know to go somewhere else. There's not always going to be a perfect match for you in terms of how you learn in your textbook or how your teacher, professor teaches. Sometimes you need to go to the internet and look for a reliable video. So a big one I'm a fan of is Khan Academy. And watch that video and say to yourself, okay, now do I understand how it works? Okay, now let me paraphrase how this works. Because what you're doing then is you're making sure you're staying in touch with the objectives of the class, but you're moving on to resources that will actually explain things to you in a way that you understand. So your first task for translation is to have those 5 overarching goals per chapter, and then paraphrase the answer to those 5 overarching questions or goals. Like I said, that paraphrase doesn't have to be words, especially for physiology. I'm a big fan of diagrams. Arrow to arrow to arrow to arrow. The way I think of everything for physiology is directions. You take a right on this street, then you take a left on this street, then you take a right on this street, and then you take a left on this street. And then I go back and I put in what the actual street names are. It's the same thing for physiology for me, is that the blood has to flow through these 4 places. Now let me go back through and put what the names of the 4 places are. Once I understand how blood flows through, now I can begin to make sense of what's going on. So draw pictures, make diagrams. If it's words work for you, put it in words. And that will help you describe those physiological processes in your own words so that you can actually apply things instead of just regurgitate to me what you've transcribed from your class notes. So examples of being able to test if you have done translation. Like we saw before, our recall was what is the enteric nervous system? Here it is in your own words, define the enteric nervous system. Or diagram how the digestive system receives messages from the enteric nervous system. Or describe the process of nervous stimulation of the digestive system. So these would be all examples of translation type questions you could ask yourself. Now your task for interpretation is comparing and contrasting. So when we compare and we contrast, there's a lot of that we do happens within our muscular system. So we can compare and we contrast our thin versus our thick filaments. We can then give them their proper names, myosin and actin. We can also compare and contrast different types of movements that our muscles do. We can compare and contrast complete technique versus incomplete technique. So we can look at our different types. So now we're moving into comparing and contrasting. We're not going to be able to compare and contrast any of that stuff if we didn't understand that basic anatomy from recall or those physiological processes from being able to interpret the information in our own words. We want to determine cause and effect. That's that calcium example that I was giving you. What happens if there's no calcium? Muscles don't contract. What happens if there's too much calcium? Muscles contract normally. So then we want to be able to think about it along those lines. You could take that even further than that, and I could really challenge you. What happens if there's too much calcium? Muscles contract normally, and the skeletal system absorbs the excess calcium. You learn that in the skeletal system. What hopefully they won't test you like that, right? Hopefully it'll stick to the body system. So you can go through and you can put them all together along those lines. So questions that you'd want to use for interpretation: how is the enteric nervous system like the central nervous system? How is it different? What happens to the digestive system if there is injury to the CNS but not to the enteric nervous system? So here we're comparing and we're contrasting different pieces. And then application is going to be grouping or classifying information together. So now we're looking at that larger overview of how does this all work as a large picture. So overall, how does the musculoskeletal system work? Overall, how do joints move? We're now looking, instead of at individual joints, individual muscles, we're looking at how do they relate to each other. So an example of this would be describe the enzymes that digest carbohydrates starting in the mouth through the small intestine. Another example of something like this might be explain how blood flows through the muscles, starting with the heart, going all the way through those muscles back to the heart. That would be describing the entire process that you may have. Or it may be explain what happens from the time that a nervous signal is received to the muscle to the time the muscle relaxes. That's putting all of the pictures together. So these are going to be different ways that you want to think about things. And then analysis, just to kind of prepare you for where you're headed, would be along the lines of identifying stated or inferred details that support a main idea or conclusion. So this might be, can the digestive system function without the central nervous system? So it's removing a piece of information. So this would be, this could happen. It could say, which of the following electrolytes would be critical for the musculoskeletal system to utilize? And then we've removed it. We haven't told you what you need to know. You have to remember that calcium is the critical one. So that would be an example of analysis level question that could be asked in your anatomy and physiology class. Identifying information relevant to the solution of the problem. So what are essential enzymes in the breakdown of proteins would be one example. Another example, if we think about the musculoskeletal system, would be something along the lines of, what would be a way to, let me think here for a second. What would be a way to address a lack of calcium? So what would be one way to address a lack of calcium in the body? So how could we fix that? That again would require a lot of analytical information, because you'd have to know the skeletal system would have to release calcium into the blood, or there would have to be an oral intake of increased calcium. So one of the two would have to happen there, okay? And then other things would be identifying gas in a logical sequence of events. So you want to go through, or I should say tasks, in a logical sequence of events. So this is exactly what you want to say. You want to go through and you want to say, when we start with something, this happens first, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. And that is exactly like I was explaining with directions. That's all physiology is. All physiology is directions to someone's house that you've never been to before, pre-GPS, pre-Waze, when you had to memorize the directions before you went. I don't know if any of you guys remember those days, but I do. You had to look them up on the map before you left, memorize the directions there, and then you had to remember how to get to the house, okay? So that's going to be something that you might want to be able to do as well. So the other thing that I quickly want to address, and then we're going to pass it over to Elizabeth, is lack of experience, or some challenges that you may face. If you have a lack of experience in asking questions, practice with index or digital note cards like Quizlet. So do those practice questions, but remember that's your last step. That's not your first step. That's like the day or two before the exam when you've been studying for 2 weeks. Do not go into that beforehand. I just saw shocked faces. You should be studying. And by studying, I don't mean studying for the exam for 2 weeks. You should have your hands on material every day. Maybe that's where I should have started. You should have your hands on material every single day. just reviewing your class notes, figuring out how you're going to put it in your own words, but you need to have your hands on this material every day. Practice with a study partner. This is key, because things that you understand well, your partner may not, and things your partner may not understand well, you may understand well. So having that exchange is essential. And review different types of question wording. I always encourage people not just to stick to their textbook practice questions. Go to practice questions from other textbooks as well, because I guarantee your professor doesn't just take questions from the textbook. And you need to take a look at how things are worded from other writers of test questions in addition to the ones from your textbook. If you have trouble with concentration, study in a quiet place. Don't have music playing, anything along those lines. Study for short periods of time. I don't care if it's 20 minutes, 10-minute break, 20 minutes, 10-minute break, 20 minutes, 10-minute break, half-hour break, and then you come back. Figure out what works for you, but study in shorter periods of time if you have trouble with concentration. I know I do. I can easily sit in a library for 6 hours. I know for a fact I retain nothing after the first 60 minutes. So can I sit still for 6 hours? Yeah. Can I study for more than 60 minutes? No. So what's the point of that? So you have to be able to familiarize yourself with how well your concentration lasts. You want to use the SQ3R, which is to survey. This is what we were talking about. Survey what you're going to read. Come up with your 5 questions about what that chapter you're going to target to answer. Read it, recite it in your own words, and then review. So this is going to be the best way that you can approach reading your chapters. And then, like we said, set learning goals. So those will be those 5 goals you're going to set for yourself on here's what I'm going to learn from this chapter. Bless you. And this is just going to be an example of how that could look. So if we look at SQ3R, survey questions, so that could be 10 minutes, reading, reciting, could be 30 minutes, review, and then you take a 10-minute break. So this is just an example of what that could look like. If there's a lot of unfamiliar terms, I know for a fact sitting in an anatomy class sometimes feels like you're sitting in a French class and you've never taken French. That's because anatomy is not based in English. Anatomy and physiology is based in Latin. So a lot of times we are sitting up in lecture and 50% of the words coming out of the professor's mouth are not English. So you have to familiarize yourself with terms you're not familiar with. And again, the nice thing with it being based in Latin is the fact that there are heavily based in prefixes and suffixes. So if you begin to train yourself to recognize those prefixes and suffixes, the number of vocabulary words that seem new to you will go down with every body system that you learn. So you want to make sure you're looking at unfamiliar terms in context. Use structural analysis, like we were talking about, the prefixes and the suffixes. Use that glossary in the back of your book. If your book doesn't have a glossary, which I can't imagine it doesn't, go ahead and go to Google and search what it means. Or find the word in a dictionary or thesaurus, and I should just change to Google, because I know none of you guys have a dictionary or thesaurus. If you don't understand, read or skim for main ideas. Scan for specific information. Read out loud the confusing points. One of the most biggest errors people make is they read silently to themselves the same confusing point over and over and over again. And that is kind of like that thing that you do something, what is it, who said it, Einstein, that you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome each time. If you keep reading silently to yourself the same thing you don't understand, you're not going to get a different outcome. Try to read it out loud. If reading it out loud doesn't help, that's when you go to YouTube or try to find a different source to help explain it to you. You see it here again, paraphrase, put it in your own words. You've got to do that to be able to apply information. Consult an alternate source. That could be another textbook even. So you could look and see if there's another textbook that speaks more clearly to you. Reset your learning goals. You may find that your 5 learning goals, you thought one was really important and that one wasn't as important. There's something way more important than that. Don't be afraid to change your learning goals. See an instructor or a tutor. Again, I'm in 321. If you see my door open and you need some clarification, feel free to stop by. And again, the importance of a study group, talking things out. Speed is often an issue. Adjust your speed to purpose. So if this is going to be a long study session, then allow yourself to take time. If it's going to be a short study session, pick something that you can study quickly. Practice with a variety of different materials. And read recreationally. I know that sounds like, how on earth am I going to find time for that? But that'll actually speed up your reading in classroom. If you have difficulty following a section in the book, outline or map the paragraph. Find and label the main idea of each paragraph and summarize the main ideas in your own words. I hope you're picking up on a theme here. And this is the last thing, and I really want you to pay attention to this last pyramid. We started with a pyramid, we're finishing with a pyramid. This pyramid is really for you, though. Here's how people learn and what they retain. 5%. That is all you retain from going to lecture. Now, that is not an excuse not to attend lecture, okay? Because what's going to happen in lecture is they're going to give you an introduction to what you need to know, and they're also going to give you highlights of what's the most important things to know. So lecture is a very key piece. But you cannot think that I'm going to go to lecture and do well on a test. Lecture, you only retain 5% of what you learn. Reading, you retain 10% of what you learn. Audio-visual, you retain 20% of what you learn. Demonstrating, you retain 30% of what you learn. So this is what I'm talking about with exercising your muscles, different things. Discussion groups, so that study partner, study groups, there you're going to retain 50% of what you learn. Practice by doing, so again, those muscles, like going to the gym, 75% of what you learn, going to lab practical sessions. And then lastly, teaching others. Like I said, I was not the best anatomy student. I truly believe I did not fully understand anatomy and physiology until the day I stood in front of a classroom and started teaching anatomy and physiology. Now I get it, okay? So the more you teach someone else, the more you will retain, okay? So keep that in mind. You have to have a lot of different strategies to be able to retain enough information for your test. So I'm going to go ahead. I'll hang out if there's any questions for me afterwards. But I'm going to introduce Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's going to talk to you about how she studied and answer any questions you may have.
Hi guys, I'm Liz. I'm an anatomy tutor. I'm a sophomore. So the way that I studied in anatomy was different than any other way that I studied for any other classes, especially now going forward in nursing classes. I kind of found that I studied in 2 parts. The first part was more by myself and kind of just focusing in on what I didn't know or what I did know. And that consisted of me kind of reading the textbook, going through mastering. Really helped me also because mastering kind of consolidated a lot of stuff into a lot less stuff because the textbook has so much information. It's so much easier to see kind of like what types of questions they would ask about a certain topic. So once I read the textbook, kind of took notes on that, my second part would be like studying with a study group because like she said, teaching other people is so helpful, and I found that sometimes I knew stuff better than my friends did or vice versa. It was a lot easier to like kind of bounce ideas off each other and talk through processes, especially like different cycles and stuff. We would get like a whiteboard and write out the cycles and rewrite them in our own words. And it made a lot more sense just going through it with other people, because sometimes when you're studying by yourself, you're like, oh, I know that. But then when you go to talk about it with other people, you're like, oh, maybe I didn't know that as well as I think I did. So I found that studying with a study group after I already studied on my own kind of drove home some key points that I knew I needed to know. I don't have any questions.